Sure.
Welcome back to Recruiter Radio. I'm your host, Kyle West. My guest this week, retired Navy Captain William Toti, who's just published a book, From CO to CEO, helping military veterans transition to the corporate workplace. William, pleasure to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Kyle.
So why did you write this book? What inspired you?
The interesting thing, well, when I transitioned from military duty to industry in 2006, I went through several transition training programs that the military puts you through. And the intent of these programs is to prepare you for life on the outside, right, for industry. And, at the time, I believed everything I was being told during these transition programs. I was placed by a recruiter, a headhunter, and, and I actually had several opportunities presented to me by this headhunter. That was one of the great things about it. And initially, I had no idea how to weigh these various opportunities against each other. And I do go into this in detail in the book, and I try to share with candidates a matrix or a calculation, or and if you do get multiple offers, how do you evaluate them? And I actually build a matrix for them. But getting back to the main point, much of what I was told during my industry transition training by the military turned out to be wrong. And so I transitioned to industry with all of these preconceived notions about what success would look like in industry, what I needed to do to succeed. And turns out almost everything they told me was wrong. And over the course of my career, 15 years in industry, leading to my CEO position at Spartan Corporation, I saw other veterans making the very, very same mistakes. And so you see thousands of veterans transition to industry, and the failure rate is substantially higher than it ought to be. Folks transition, they learn that much of what they thought they knew is wrong. Some adapt and are able to, flex and succeed anyway. Others just kind of get disheartened and fail. And I finally, after years of watching this, decided I need to write all this stuff down, these lessons I've learned over the course of these 15 years in industry. And as I kept writing more and more, it turned out into book form. And so published in April this month, and very excited to see it hit the bookstores just a few weeks ago.
Congratulations. It's a real endeavor to write a book and to get it published. I'm in the process of doing something similar myself on similar types of life lessons learned and mistakes made. But what are these things that the Army's teaching you, or sorry, the Navy, the Army, the Armed Forces, what are they teaching you that was wrong? What's the main thing that really jumps out at you as bad information you were getting?
There's many, but the first thing that jumps out is, what I refer to in the book as the great lie. And the great lie, it pertains to people who, like me, were civilian at senior levels in the military when they transitioned. And the great lie is, what they tell you is, you've succeeded at a senior position in this industry. All your civilian company wants from you is good leadership. And, if you give it 20 minutes of thought when they tell you this, you would know that can't possibly be true, because it's not even true in the military. And if it was, you'd be able to take a strategic wing bomber commander from the Air Force and put them on a submarine as captain of a submarine. And that person who has good leadership, one would expect, should be able to succeed in this position as captain of a submarine. Of course he cannot. And we would never expect that that's true in the military. And yet when the transition folks tell you that that's true for industry, we swallow it. We want to believe it. And it's not true. It's a great lie, because it gives you this warm feeling of satisfaction or comfort that I have everything that it takes to succeed in industry, when it's not true. And by becoming comfortable with my position when I transition and not realizing, wait a minute, there's a lot I need to learn to succeed in industry, and this good leadership stuff isn't going to help with any of that. I come in with the wrong attitude,
Mm.
and then the wrong attitude leads to failed expectations, and the failed expectations lead to a failure to adapt, which in some cases, too many cases, I'm afraid, leads to failure in the position. So then the candidate has failed, the company's dissatisfied, the company's mad at the recruiter for recruiting somebody into a position they weren't qualified for or prepared for.
Yeah.
And so everybody's heart is broken. And that's one of the things I try to address with the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, from a recruiter perspective, I'm very curious to hear your advice on working with veterans who are transitioning, who are getting out of the armed forces, getting out of the military and moving into what we call the corporate workplace. How would you structure the advice to recruiters working with veterans? What do you think are some of the things that recruiters can benefit from this book?
Well, I think the biggest problem with recruiters is the same as the biggest problem with the company, the hiring company. And it's that they don't know what they don't know.
Hmm.
And what they don't know is they don't know what the veterans are good at and what they're not good at, what they may not be so knowledgeable about. And I think that reading the book, for veterans too, I think, although the subtitle is a practical guide for transitioning from military to industry leadership, I think recruiters benefit from reading the book because it brings context to them on what military folks understand when they transition and where their gaps of knowledge lie. And so the first piece of advice I would give to recruiters is make your veteran that you're trying to recruit read the book, because it will help that veteran succeed. And, of course, when the veteran succeeds, the recruiter is successful as well. So that's the first bit of advice. The second bit of advice, and this is one of those inflection point moments that I talk about in the book, is the veteran needs to be trained that when they transition to industry, all of what they've learned needs to be pushed during their active duty time, needs to be pushed into the background, kind of sublimated. And they need to understand that they're starting all over again. And in fact, I tell veterans, it doesn't matter if you're a colonel, when you're transitioning, or even a general, when you're transitioning out of the military, when you join that company, you ought to think of yourself as a second lieutenant all over again, because you're starting with zero level of knowledge of what it's going to take to succeed. Now, your background's going to allow you to accelerate much more quickly than your peers also joining the company at the same time might be able to. So that's all good. And unlike the military, where people get promoted in lockstep, in industry, of course, there's no rules. You get promoted when your skills allow you to get promoted and people think you're ready to be promoted. And that's a wonderful thing about industry. But the point I'm making here is there's this book that I recommend to veterans called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And in the book, it talks about this delusion of success. And in many cases, the more successful somebody was in their past life, the greater risk there is that they're going to fail in their future life, because they're deluded into believing that past success yields future success. And that's absolutely not true, because their success in the past occurred in a certain, condition of requirements and capabilities, and with a team and an environment that the veteran well understood. None of those factors will be present after they transition.
Yeah.
And the more successful they've had in the past, the more confident they're likely to be in future success, the riskier it actually is for them. So it's kind of, an oxymoron, or, but that's something that veterans need to understand, that their past failure may actually set them up. Their past success may actually set them up for future failure.
Yeah. Yeah. So they've created an expectation that may not be realistic. And it sounds like the counselors from the military are feeding into that a little bit by telling them that, having been a captain, you're going to be able to step into a C-level executive leadership role with those same leadership skills and succeed. Do you think they're doing that to build up confidence? Do you think is it misguided optimism?
It's the latter, Kyle. I
Yeah,
eventually convinced myself it was the blind leading the blind.
right.
The way the government issues these contracts to train transitioning military people, won't surprise you to hear this, the contract is awarded to the lowest bidder.
Right.
And to win such a contract, you've got to bid people who are cheap. And cheap people, it generally means they have not been there and done it themselves. They weren't successful in industry before they were hired to do this training job themselves, because if they were successful in industry, they wouldn't be cheap. And so you hire the lowest bidder. The lowest bidder has to hire people they can afford to bid for the price they need to win. And what it ends up being is people regurgitating a lesson plan that they don't really understand. And that's what I mean when I say the blind leading the blind. So they're not doing that out of malice. They just don't know better. And the active duty people in the military who manage these programs are still on active duty. They have not transitioned themselves. So they don't know what industry is like either. So you've got the people supervising and the people doing the teaching, none of which have ever actually done it themselves. And the people like me who have done it and have seen what it takes to succeed and what it takes to fail, we're not asked for our help. And so we end up having to write books in order to get the word out.
Yeah. Well, it's important to get that word out. It must be a very difficult transition to the private sector, the corporate sector, from the military. Is it a case of, and I'm just speculating, is it a case of having that support hierarchy and regulations removed and having to learn how to adapt to that environment where there's not a structure, or is it something else that causes that type of failure?
No, it's a great observation, Kyle, because one of the first things I was told when I was in my first job in industry, where I was really struggling with this lack of structure that you just referred to. And I did not put this in the book, but it's kind of interesting that you raised the question. One of my first bosses said to me, "You military people, you're uncomfortable with how did he express it? With lack of structure, and you need to become comfortable with not ambivalence, but
Ambiguity.
unfamiliarity." Pardon?
Right. Ambiguity, perhaps.
Ambiguity. Thank you very much. It's exactly what he said.
Yeah.
He says, military folks struggle with ambiguity.
Mhm.
And in order to succeed in industry, you will be surrounded by ambiguity. And you need to learn how to thrive in ambiguity. And that's a very amorphous concept, right? It's hard to put your arms around that, and hard to teach people how to thrive in ambiguity. But there's another very discrete example I do give in the book, and it talks about organization charts. And I say an organization chart, you'll find one in every company, but it's not the same as a chain of command in industry. And in fact, if you think of it as a chain of command, you're going to likely fail, because in the military, chains of command are, you got to proceed one step at a time, one level, one echelon at a time. And if you skip steps, you're likely to get whacked, right? Somebody's going to take your head off.
Yeah.
In industry, nothing is more important than success. And that org chart is amorphous. It's not really structured like a chain of command. And if you need to skip steps and go directly to your boss's boss or whatever it takes in order to get the decision made on time to succeed, if you don't do that, you're likely to get whacked. So it's a very different culture and environment that you need to get used to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we have a comparison in the recruiting business between what we call big company candidates and small company candidates, and we use that term tolerance for ambiguity to describe someone who is more comfortable in a small company. And in a small company, there is no structure. And the rule of thumb is if you're waiting for someone, if you're looking for someone to do the job, you're probably just going to end up doing it yourself. So just go ahead and start doing it. Whereas if you're coming from a big company, there are people to do certain things, and you don't want to step outside that structure. You don't want to push the boundaries of what people are doing. They have their job description and they stay inside it. In a small company, everybody does whatever they need to, and they all just succeed or fail based on those abilities to take initiatives, deal with change, pivot quickly, turn on a dime, as we say. You can't turn a battleship, you can't turn an aircraft carrier very easily. Once they're in a direction, they don't change. And does that sound very similar to what you're dealing with in terms of getting into an unstructured, high change environment? Is that?
It does. In fact, yeah, absolutely. I said I had multiple offers that I was lucky enough to have presented to me when I was leaving the military. One was with a big company, one was with a small company. And I, without any intelligence or information to help me make my decision, I elected to go to the job in the big company. And holy cow, what a difference that made. That was exactly the right decision. Because as you say, in the small company, there is no structure.
Yeah.
There's very little process. And so the big company, I learned wonderful process that I would not have learned in the small company. I later ended up working in a couple of different small companies, and I was able to bring that process I learned from the big company to the mom and shop, including the company I ended up being CEO of. And if I had done it the other way, I'm pretty sure I would not have ever made it to CEO. And you say, well, that's kind of counterintuitive, because if you start with a small company, your chance of being CEO of that small company is greater.
Yeah.
Well, actually, no, because you never learn the skills that would allow you to excel as CEO. You might become CEO and fail.
Yeah.
But the skills that I learned in the big company. And so my advice to transitioning military folks, if they're going to take their very first ever civilian job, is to go to a company that's willing to invest in you and train you. And a lot of times small companies don't have the time or money to wait on you learning the job. They need you to perform now, so that they don't train you. And two, the structure is so that if you, that failure is not going to be an immediate exit. And again, in small companies, sometimes they don't have the depth, the bench depth, to allow somebody to train, to fail, and then, okay, we'll give you a year or so to learn the job. No. We don't have the depth to be able to do that. So I do advise transitioning military folks, if they have a choice between a big company and a small company, they're probably going to be better served with the big company.
Yeah. Yeah, but not to say that they wouldn't thrive in a smaller company, but it sounds like there's some skills needed to adapt to that. Is it hard to let go and find humility, having been a captain, having been a commander, where people respond to your every word and command, to having to go to second lieutenant again, as you said? Was that a difficult transition? Did you find that really hard to let go?
It is, and I don't want to minimize that. It's actually very different. There's a bunch of cultural differences, of course, that you start missing the culture of the military after you left it.
Yeah.
But from a leadership standpoint, I tell my active duty friends, all of whom believe that they're great leaders, right? I say, yeah, leadership is hard, but it's even harder when you're leading people who can actually quit.
Yeah.
And that's not a problem you've had in the past. And so you may not be as good a leader as you think you are until you join an industry job where when people vote with their feet, right? Yeah. So if you're doing a poor job, they're going to leave, and you're going to learn, well, maybe I wasn't as good a leader as I thought I was. So on one hand, it was hard to let go. In particular, when my first company, when I got hired on, they said, well, we want to send you a leadership course. And I said, my God, I'm thinking to myself, are you kidding me? I've led thousands of sailors over the course of my career. You want to send me, I trained leaders, and you want to send me to a leadership course? And I swallowed my pride. And I said, okay, if you think I could benefit from it. I remembered I'm an ensign again. That's Navy for second lieutenant.
Yeah.
I'll go. And when I got to the course, it turns out it was about business leadership, not leadership per se in an ethereal sense. It was about developing a winning strategy and a winning vision for a business. And it was very useful. But again, if I had hardened up and said, harumph, what, I'm offended that you would think I need leadership training. I felt a little twinge of that when they first recommended it to me, right? But I didn't say anything. I swallowed my pride. I went to it and learned, wow, this is really beneficial. And so, but there's a bunch of those kinds of events you have to go through after you transition. And if you take the right attitude, every one of them will make you better.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were able to step into that big company, take on a progressive role, and then transition to a smaller company. What was that like for you, going to a smaller company and then having to reinvent yourself again? Did you struggle with that at first? That must have been a real challenge.
I did, because it was exactly the way you described it. You start looking for the backup structure. Well, let's see, continuous improvement. We need to implement a continuous improvement process in our manufacturing. Where are all my continuous improvement guys and gals? Oh, I only have one, and they may not actually know what they're doing very much. And so, all right, it's up to me, roll up my sleeves, work with the person, help them improve the continuous improvement policy program or quality. Financial reporting, everything. You're starting with an austere staff, and whereas you used to be a specialist with a bunch of other specialists working for you with wonderful human resources and information system. So you got a terrific HRIS system that you can glean data about your employee population. You've got a great recruiting team, internal and external, that you're drawing from. And you go to a small company, none of that's there. And some of it you can't afford. Some of it you can, and you need to figure out, what do I really need? And that means I'm going to have to pay for it that I don't have today. And what can I do without? What can we insource? What can we improve our training to make better internally? And that's a lot of decisions that you've got to make in that small company that you never needed to make in the big company. But here's the point again. Unless I learned what a good quality program looks like from my big company, what a good HRIS system can give me from my big company, I don't think I would have known what I needed to know to succeed in that small company. If I'd grown up in industry, that might be a different story. But that's the other thing about transitioning out of the military and industry. You've lost a lot of years that you would have learned industry ways, industry stuff. So you really need to jumpstart your learning when you make the transition, especially if you transition in your mid-40s like I did.
Yeah.
Now, I've lost 20 years. How do I make up for those 20 years? And that learning from the big company really helped me make up for that lost time.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's go back to advice for recruiters. Is there any way that we could suggest for a recruiting professional to work better with veterans? And are there perhaps specific types of questions that might help to determine if this person's ready to set aside their humility, ready to step into industry environment? Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of identifying who's best able to transition from the military?
Yeah, so I'll start with questions you probably shouldn't ask.
Okay.
During my Pentagon tours, I managed, I'll put the word in quotes, a large financial budget for the Navy. We're talking billions of dollars. And that led me to believe, in fact, I had a subspecialty called financial management. And that led me to believe I knew more about finance than I really did. Okay. Turns out what I did was financial management oversight, wasn't really financial management.
Right.
It turns out I knew nothing that I needed to know about finances when I entered industry. I was starting from a zero level of knowledge. But I do remember my headhunter say, "Hey, do you have any background in finance?" And I said, "Well, of course, I'm overseeing multi-billion dollars worth of investment for the Navy." Yeah, that would meant nothing. So the question that, from the recruiter's standpoint, assume the transitioning military person knows absolutely nothing about finance compared to what they will need to know in industry. So that's one of those things that I think it helps to understand. The second thing is I really do believe you need to probe the transitioning veterans' self-awareness and stridency. I'll use that word. How strident are they? How willing to change are they? Do they understand that this is going to be a new environment where they're basically going to be starting from scratch? And that's not an exaggeration, even as I'm transitioning in my mid-40s, to say, so you're going to be placed in the positions alongside 25-year-olds, recent college graduates. How are you going to deal with that situation from an emotional standpoint, from a self-worth standpoint? Are you going to be okay with that? And they're going to say, well, of course, they're not going to put me in that position. I'm an experienced senior leader. Why would they do that? Because you don't know anything you need to know to succeed. So you got a lot of great life experience, which is really all it was, right? But from the business standpoint, you have no business experience. And if you're deluding yourself into believing you do, you might need a gut check here. So that's another aspect of it, I think, that is worth probing from the recruiting standpoint. The other thing is look for the language, the body language, and Zoom allows you to evaluate body language to some extent, but also the words. I had one Marine transitioning leader, and I said, "How would you describe yourself?" And his immediate response was, "I'm a leader of men." You are? Wow. How do you think your female employees are going to feel about that? And so, and that's just kind of a really worrisome bell ringer.
Yeah.
And it might seem like a minor thing, but it could be a huge signal that this person is like locked up still in the 20 years ago environment.
Yeah.
And
it's a different world out there. I mean,
it is.
The business leaders, the challenge now are unprecedented. We have a workforce that is not accepting really any kind of limitations on their ability to work from home now. You have the new generation, what we call millennials, who are in demand, very aware that they are in demand. And like you said earlier, they will vote with their feet, and they're doing so in ways that I have never seen as a recruiter. Like, it's unprecedented. And the challenge for leaders to hire and retain talent comes down to connecting with them on a level that allows them to build a very close bond. So there is a challenge to connect with people for anyone, let's say from our generation with the next generation. It's very different. So you have that added element. Trying to get people to come to an office when they don't want to is proving to be a real challenge. I had a sales leader tell me they lost 12 people in a month because the company told them they had to work 3 days a week. And I'm thinking, 3 days a week, a couple of years ago, that would put you on the best companies to work for list,
Absolutely.
But not anymore. So there's new challenges. It's going to make it even more difficult to transition to a leadership position. I guess the question I wanted to ask is, are there things the military teaches you about connecting with people and
Mm.
creating that bond of teamwork, creating that band of brothers where they fight for each other? Is there an applicable skill, do you think, that leaders from the military can bring to these types of challenges?
The short answer is yes. The good leaders do learn those kinds of skills where, taking the team approach, bringing their crews, for if you're Navy, your team, your company, your battalion, if you're Army, forward with you, and having everyone understand the mission and invested in the mission. So the good leaders are really, really good. Unfortunately, you wish you could say that the military filters out all the bad leaders. Let me tell you, I've seen a lot of bad colonels who are bad leaders. So again, to your recruiting audience, just because they're a senior military official rank is not a guarantee that they're going to have learned the right kind of leadership skills. There is still in the military, and I do talk about this in the book a little bit, almost what I would call a culture of conscription. That's what General Colin Powell used to call it. Draft ended in 1973. And yet some people in the military still act as if, especially junior enlisted people, are draftees. They I wouldn't say abuse them, but just short of abusing them, rather than leading them in a 21st century way. And so you've got to be wary of that and to try to find out, okay, now what leadership characteristics is this person going to bring? And those soft skills are things you can, and I've done in interviews myself with the thousands of people I've hired over the last 15 years. Those are the kinds of things that interviews do really try to reveal. And I think you can be effective in exposing people who won't transition well from a leadership standpoint.
Yeah. You can't really yell at people and expect them to fall into line. The drill sergeant approach probably isn't going to work in the modern workplace environment.
Let me riff off of your point on working from home for a minute, because I do have transitioning people who I say, well, what are you thinking? What do you think you want to do? And in the book, I really make sure I frame it very carefully. The question is not what kind of job you want when you get out. The question is, where do you want to be in 10 years?
Right.
And what's the kind of job that will get you there? So it's a reframing of the question I was asked when I was transitioning from the military. But sometimes people do say, you know what, I'd really like to be able to work from home. And I say, well, you know what, there's a whole bunch of problems with that. First of all, you're a transitioning veteran. You lost a lot of years compared to people that start in industry straight out of college. So that's problem number one. And in order to get those years back, you really do need to interact with people in a business environment. And you can't do that if you're working from home. Problem number two is when companies decide it's time for reduction in force, which happens to every company sooner or later, they're going to let people go. The first group of people they're going to let go are the people that they don't see, and they wonder what value they're adding. And those are the people who work from home. So that's problematic. So I, tell people, so while you're saying, look, it's a much better idea if you go to a job where you're in the office, where you can be seen, where you can interact. By the way, it's a much more efficient way to function and perform interaction face-to-face rather than having to dial up on Zoom or phone.
Yeah.
It is doubly true for transitioning veterans. They need to be in the office in order to accelerate their learning and get to where they were and make up for those lost years. So that's really important. The second thing I provide folks is there's three factors that you trade off when you're looking at jobs. It's going to be the type of job, the compensation, and the location. And a lot of times transitioning veterans will say, you know what, I want a job, but I want it here. I don't want to move because all of those times the military made me move over all these years. And I tell people that is a big mistake. And as a recruiter, I would tell them the same thing. Because of those three factors, type of job, compensation, and location, you're going to be lucky to get two out of the three, what you want. right?
Yep.
And if you got to give one up, give up location. Because unlike the military, they're not going to require you to rotate every 2 or 3 years. So one last move into the place, in the kind of job you want, you really need, and the compensation that you want, one last move is really, really worth it. So I don't want to hear this, I don't want to move again. Nonsense, right? And what that tells me is you're really not interested in a career, you're interested in a job. Okay, if that's the case, I can't help you. So that's the last bit of advice for your recruiting audience.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a valuable bit of advice. It's a very applicable set of changes that applies from big company to small company. We used to have a saying that if you've been at a big company too long, you'll never be able to transition. And we used to pick on, well, we'll pick on IBM because they're the ones that indoctrinate their people. And there's a stigma.
The IBM way, Big Blue and all of that. Yeah,
exactly. And there's a stigma attached to being at IBM too long. Other companies in the space who might even compete would look at an IBM, let's say 20-year tenure, and say, there's no way they're going to transition. There's no way they're going to make it. They'll never succeed outside of IBM. Do you think that's true in the military? Is there a point where you've been in the military too long that you can't transition?
Yeah, it could be. And one of the things I talk about in the book is, for people that want to stay in to pretend to compete for general or admiral, first of all, there's a tiny fraction of folks actually make it. And so I say, look, if you think you're competitive and that's what you want, go for it. Great. We need the best generals and admirals we can get. But don't think that making general or admiral is going to help you in your civilian career. It's not, because a lot of times companies develop a stereotype that may seem unfair, but you'd be surprised it's fairer than you might think, that once you've made general admiral, you've forgotten how to work. You have this staff that you're surrounded by that does all the work for you. And you need a posse every place you go. You're a bit of a prima donna. And whereas defense companies in particular love to have a stable of generals and admirals that the CEO can show off, it's not necessarily good training for civilian jobs. So there is a point at which, and oh, by the way, in order to make general admiral, you're going to probably have to stay in the military until your late 50s.
Yeah.
Because if you want to retire in that rank, you have to serve a certain number of years in that rank before you retire. And then that closes. I talk in the book about the difference between ageism and age as a protected class feature, and runway, or how much time is the company going to necessarily get out of you. And your runway is shortened if you transition as a senior of an officer. So I do talk about those factors, but I would say that, yeah, there is a certain point at which the risk of success goes up.
Yeah.
And that companies ought to look hard before they do hire those folks.
Yeah. Yeah. This may be an unfair question, but is there a branch of the military that transitions easier than others?
No, not really. I would love to say, yeah, the Navy. Yeah. But the truth is, it has more to do with the individual than it does the service. Now, there are regimented thinkers in all 5 of the services now. If you 6 if you include the Coast Guard, they're not military, but they're armed force. So there are regimented thinkers that don't transition well. I will say that some of the services reward the regimented thinkers more than other services do that prefer independence of thought and things like that, but I'm not going to name them. I'll get people mad if I do that. But it really is individual based, and what you need to do is find people that are more independently minded rather than lockstep regimented. The expression is martinet. Of course, you don't want a martinet. You don't want people that look too military, or speak too military, or think too military, because that's not going to help them in their industry career.
Is there an evaluation process in the military to determine who might fit better with a regimented thinking enterprise, and who might be better suited for, I don't know, a special ops or an independent operator? Does the military distinguish, who's more character trait openness, who's more likely to be a regimented thinker?
Well, there is an evaluation process in the military, and I talk about it a bit because in the military, you're much more likely to be told how great you are than you are in industry. And that's one of those cultural differences that I tell military folks they're going to have to get used to. When you're in industry, you're going to be told horrors, the truth about how good you're doing, right?
Yeah.
And that may not be the case in industry, because in the military, because in the military, what you don't want you want good people to run away and to leave the military prematurely. So you end up exhibiting some puffery, you're doing great, Bob. And whether Bob is really doing great or not, or somebody doesn't want to tell him the truth, is another matter. It doesn't help to parse, to sort those military fitness reports or officer evaluation reports. And in fact, I was asked at some point, there were candidates in my big companies before I became CEO who were being evaluated. They're offered up some of their fitness reports and officer evaluation reports to their future employer for, here's what they're saying about me in the military, aren't these great things? And somebody says, hey, Bill, you're a retired Navy. Can you read this and tell me what this means? And I'd say, you know what, this is not it sounds great, but a lot of times military reports are more important about what is not said about the candidate than what is said. And you need to understand the code. And the code, when you read everything, verbatim, it sounded like this was a great candidate. But when you read between the lines and understood what they didn't say about the candidate, wasn't so great. And in fact, the candidate was making a mistake by providing those to us, because I was able to read between the lines and it didn't help him.
Right.
But so I would say that recruiters, not very useful.
Yeah, it sounded like a good idea, but now that I hear your side of it, it doesn't sound so helpful at all. Do you have a preference for hiring ex-military when you're hiring now? Do you tend to look for ex-military types, or?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, properly trained, if they come in with the right attitude, they're going to make great workers, because there's an expression in the military that we drive through the suck, right? This sucks, but I'm going to just drive through it. So you can get through really hard times. Most military folks have had to learn how to drive through the suck and get through really hard times. And in industry, you're going to have some of those hard times. And in fact, for my military folks, I share this. My very first job, there was an opportunity to lead a competitive pursuit, something obviously I had no idea how to do. And this was for a very big program. It was kind of a live or die program for my company, for my division in my company. And if we won it, our future was going to be set for a while. If we lost it, we were going to be at risk, And so I was kind of learning how to run the division, and I offered to step in to lead the pursuit. I had no idea how to do this, but I knew I could learn, right? And so I volunteered to do this, and then for some reason they accepted, because they weren't getting any other volunteers. And I dove in and I took training, everything that I could possibly learn, and I tried to build a team. And I worked 7 days a week for 3 straight months. Okay. Mm-hmm. And people in the military say, what? Yes, I worked 7 days a week for 3 straight months. You have to do things like that, even in industry. Not often. It's rare. But don't think that just because you're not in the military anymore, that you aren't going to have to do hard things. The good news is we won the program. And so, it was a great learning experience for me. But I told my family, you got to pretend I'm on deployment again. This is like being on deployment, right? You aren't going to see much of me. You thought that when I retired from the Navy, this wouldn't happen anymore, but it does sometimes happen. And getting that across to military folks who are transitioning, that there are going to be requirements sometimes to do really hard things. And if you don't get that in your mind, then you're going to be disappointed. I think that a recruiter can help set that stage for them.
Yeah. And I think it's important to have these discussions. And I think your book is important at an important time. Like I said, there is a shortage of talent out there. There's a shortage of resources in general. And I think maybe helping industry executives to hire veterans, helping veterans to understand how to adapt to industry could be a really important step into alleviating some of that shortage. So I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to thank you for the book. And it was really a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Kyle. Pleasure being here.